Nice little video, and you can see my music selection over here to the right. So this is a video for the latest feature for the web terminal, which is talking about file syncing. So before, people would spin up, the web terminal would start a pre-configured environment, but as I make changes in the Web IDE, those changes were never synced to the terminal. So now in 12.0, we just released a feature where making changes here in the Web IDE are reflected in the terminal. So this is all this running locally. I just created this demo for UX to help review it. And it's important that I note that because it's not intuitive to get this running to start. As you can see actually here to the left, is a configuration file that's needed for if you want the Web IDE terminal available to you at all. So you have to specify, and this is nice, you get to specify what image is going to be running for that, what image is going to be running in that environment. And then for file syncing to work, you do have to specify like a service. Something that's not necessarily quite apparent here is, and especially because I clipped this video, is the startup time is a little slow, especially when running locally. Like it could take up to anywhere up to 5+ seconds for sure. But yes, so there's a little bit of configuration to get this Web IDE terminal running. But once it's running, it's pretty nice. For some reason, it doesn't default to my project directory, but that's fine. You can run just commands in the terminal, and we can see our project directory nicely. And as you can see, I can make changes, and those changes are reflected into the repositories. All of that is very sweet. But going back to our document, there's a lot of assumptions around the usability of this. And one is getting the Kubernetes runners all set up, getting this specific Web IDE configuration set up. I have to be a maintainer to even run this. There's also some issues that come up since I'm coupled to CI. This is a positive demo, so I haven't shown anything negative here. I don't have the GDK running, so I can't just do this live. But like if I hit stop terminal, that counts as a canceled build. And because of a new CI policy, we can't retry canceled builds. So when I try to retry it, I get just a random error, and I have to refresh my whole page if I want to be able to use the terminal again. That wasn't the case, but because CI changed their policy, and now that we're kind of coupled to the way CI works, we've inherited this regression, which is unfortunate. And I kind of would put that under a weakness, is this coupling to our CI requirements. So you kind of got to visually see, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I wanted to share that video because we got to visually see what the Web IDE terminal is doing. There's the Web IDE docs, which have the terminal bit to it. And you can see a lot of the notes highlighting that there's assumptions here to your environment. So I'd like to maybe itemize that list of weaknesses that we see and itemize if there's strengths that we see about this, or we could spend time talking about where we'd like to be. I really want to just start this holistic conversation. And from that, now I'm going to step back and I'm going to hit the mute button.
Okay, I'd like to talk about those restrictions. I mean, we are, okay, it doesn't seem so, but we are moving quite fast, and we are working with things that we don't really know how they are going to evolve. I mean, those restrictions regarding only maintainers can trigger the terminal, or for example, we can only have one Web IDE pipeline at a time. I mean, if you run a terminal and you open a new tab with the same project and you try to well, you won't be able to run a new terminal. Why? Because we don't know yet how our CI environment will behave with so many CI jobs. I mean, in my test, I could, for example, reuse the running pipeline, the running Web IDE. For example, you are running a Web IDE terminal, and if you open a new tab with the same project, the same pipeline, the same terminal will be open. Okay, in order to reuse this terminal. So we still have to decide how the Web IDE terminal and all this stuff is going to work. So those restrictions were the most restrictive ones we could set at that time in order to see how this feature evolves. So it's intended to be for developer mostly, because it's what makes sense. But this is still a newborn, a new feature. So we don't want to open it to the world, to the complete world, until we know that for a certain amount of users it behaves well. We don't see any I don't know, any flaw or any big red flag. So that's why those restrictions.
Is the maintainer restriction, but that's a CI limitation, and since we're built on top of CI, like, is it possible that we could just work around the maintainer restriction and put our own permissions?
No. These maintainer restrictions is set for Web IDE pipeline. So we set that restriction, not CI.
Oh, we chose that. Okay.
Yeah, we chose that. So we can change it whenever we want.
Did we choose that just to limit the usage of while we're experimenting with it?
Yeah, exactly. Because we don't want to open it to all the users, because we want to limit the risk a little bit. About the startup time, I talked to Paul and comment an idea regarding how we could boost this start time. I was thinking about the same mechanism VirtualBox does, with snapshot and resume and pause thing. But I talked to Steve at Sopardi in the CI team, and if the image is already cached, the main time goes into starting the container, starting the build. So even if we save the state or we save some kind of snapshot, the main time, even the same time, will go into starting the container. So we won't be able to speed that process. Okay. Another thing we are facing right now is that in this scenario, we are going to start more than one container. I mean, Paul showed how for the Web IDE in that video, we needed the main image, which is the build container image, and an additional image for the file syncing process. Okay. In CI, well, let's say in Kubernetes, this matching starts in parallel. So it may happen that the file sync image starts before the build image. Okay. So for the file sync mirroring, we need the cloned repository, which is cloned in the build image. So when the file sync image starts, it tries to get the repository clone in the build image, and because the build image is not ready yet, that process fails. Okay, so and the same goes for the terminal. It may happen that we try to connect to the terminal, but the build image is not ready yet. So that is something I'm going to create an issue about, because I discussed it also with Steve. We are going to create a new endpoint in the GitLab runner, something like a health check service or something like that, in order to know when all the containers are in a ready state, okay? Why? Because a job can be in different states, okay? When it starts, automatically the state is going to be in a running state, okay? But that doesn't mean that all the containers are in a ready state. So we are going to add this new endpoint to query if the containers are in a ready state before triggering all these services. Regarding the GitLab Web IDE YAML file, we can provide templates the same way we do with GitLab CI. So we can, for example, have a select box saying, what do you want to configure? Do you want live preview? Do you want file sync, mirroring? What do you want? And depending on what you select, we can fill automatically that YAML file. That can help some users with this first step with the Web IDE YAML. Okay, first of all, for all that doesn't know how the Web IDE YAML works, is a restricted version of the GitLab CI YAML, okay? It doesn't support all the syntax that the GitLab YAML does. Okay, it's a restricted version just for this. In the same way, we are adding some syntax to the Web IDE YAML that the GitLab CI YAML doesn't support. Okay, we are starting to diverge a little bit, but I think most of the things we are building in the Web IDE YAML sooner or later are going to be ported to the GitLab YAML, because I think it makes sense, because we can reuse that functionality in regular CI YAMLs, okay? But for now, we are starting to diverge, and that can cause troubles in the future because we rely on how GitLab CI YAML works. Okay, we are fine for now, but we may have problems in the future if we are too far from each other in this configuration file. And yeah, I mean, I'm also worried about the startup time because, I mean, when you use Code Sandbox or this kind of tools and you click the terminal tab, automatically pop-ups. So it feels different.
And that's what it, I mean, so I think we listed a good amount of, I itemized, I think, a lot of the weaknesses that you and I have identified here, Fran. But that's the main reason I want us to potentially talk about this from a very large, maybe vision perspective. So I'm looking forward to jumping to the next section of where would we like to be. Because yeah, you look at these other products that provide a web environment with a terminal and an editor, and it's seamless. There's no user configuration, and I realized that we get some flexibility with providing this, but yeah, there's no startup time. It's just all there, and I think part of us, I'm worried that we were looking for implementing functional requirements when we didn't really have the quality attributes that we wanted, like formalized, like it needs to start up in X amount of seconds or whatever. If we want to prioritize those, that may really change some of our architecture decisions. We may not be able to couple ourselves to CI if we need this to be very available, because pipelines typically start, they take a little bit of time to start. And especially, and now I'm actually dependent on, and you know, how many builds do I have running on my GitLab instance for my editor terminal to start? So I'd like for us to talk. I mean, we listed here on the document, and we could dive into each one. And Kai, if you think that there's any ones in here that are worth highlighting out, I like maybe for the sake of time for us to talk about what is this long-term vision of the web terminal, and are we making, and us to honestly ask ourselves, are we making the right architecture decisions that's going to help us meet those quality attributes?
Yeah, and I think so. I think we can do a couple things. I think one, one, we can go look at like the category strategy, which is what it is. It hasn't changed much, but I will say that the Web IDE is becoming kind of like a linchpin in a lot of other things that we want to do on the editor side. You know, we're looking at the Web IDE now, right? And we've got all of these features that we want to go do. And then we want to start bringing in live coding, right? Like that's kind of one of the next big milestone things that we want to do is we want to make a place where two developers connect to the same Web IDE at the same time and can do those things. And so, you know, making sure the foundational pieces of the Web IDE are there are really important for that. I think the other things that we look at when we talk about the Web IDE are use cases and who is it really targeted for? And I think there's two trains of thought, right? Like one is, could one of our engineers pick up the Web IDE on a brand new laptop and like make meaningful contributions back to the GetLab Rails app? I don't know. That feels impressive. Is it realistic? Maybe, maybe not. Like unless something was in a pinch or they grabbed a new laptop. But could one of our community contributors pick up the Web IDE and make a contribution to the Rails app without having to set up and run the GDK locally and figure all that out and get all the local dependencies configured and build a dev environment? Well, that's actually probably much more valuable, right? And when you think about this in like another company or another, like in a different context, right? Could any organization have a situation where someone can on-ramp in a minute by clicking the Web IDE button and be able to start contributing back to the application versus having to get a local environment? One of the other things that we've talked about, you know, that James has brought up before is sometimes you have to go back and patch older versions of your app, right? And well, now we're on, oh, well, my local environment's 5 Ruby versions ahead. The gem files are all different. Like, yeah, sure, I could figure out and spend a day resolving this to get an old, you know, dependency version of my app. Or could I load up the Web IDE at a state with that like dependency set involved, right? Like for a patch release for an older version. And so I think when you start looking at those use cases, right, like you really need all these features. And I wonder if, you know, I understand why we went the CI runner route, and I think it's potentially still viable, but it also feels like at some point you're going to need more compute there to do some of these tasks, right? You're going to need the ability to do other things. And I don't know if the CI runners get us there long term. And I don't know if the way all of these things are plugged together right now, if live coding is a thing that, right? Because you're really talking about the Web IDE, so the Monaco pieces, right? The place where you can edit text. You've got the live preview thing, which is kind of its own separate thing. And then you've got the terminals, which are a separate thing. And so how exactly do we send all three of those across the wire in a situation where two people want to share the same working state? Like that's to me feels, because those are so connected, but yet a little bit disconnected. I'm curious, like, those are the things that like I'm wondering, like, well, are we in a place now where we're kind of not in the right spot to go and do some of the long-term things that we want to go do? You know, and to be fair, that we hadn't necessarily thought of the use cases or hadn't well mapped out. So it's not a fault of anyone. It's just, it is what it is based on the state to get to the shippable product. So, you know, those are the things that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about where we want to go. And I think this was a good, for me, a good level set when Paul hit me up and he's like, hey, this is what you said. It doesn't quite work like that. And I was like, oh, well, it'd be good to know. And so those are the things I'm thinking about. The other thing that is in the doc that we're thinking about is, are there other editors? Like, could we rip and replace this and not build all of this functionality from scratch? Could we go find something that's more complete and do that? And so, that's the other big question. And I think it's important to understand where we want to be when we think about if we want to go invest on the rip and replace, because is one of these other things actually going to enable us to do that? Or are we going to end up in the same problems or positions that we're in now, where we're still dependent on some weird stuff that we don't quite understand or isn't working with the way we want it to, and we can't go achieve the other things that we want to do? So those are the things that I would say are important to keep in mind.
So Kai, I'd just like to add one other thing in there. So I don't know how much discussion has happened on the live coding part, but what the technology we're thinking, or at least I could see being very useful there, is the WebRTC, which doesn't necessarily require an intermediate step on the server. Although your questions are still valid, if we're still having to have the terminal be available with the changes, then we have to find a way to send that up the wire to the terminal and both having access to the terminal. But the communication between the live editors could be directly to the browsers without going to the server. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and those are the things that, like, I don't have a clue how we'll do that. That's why you guys are all much smarter than I am. But but those are the things that, like, I think we need to be taking. At this point, I feel like we're in a place where we need to be taking these things into account as we move forward.
I have a point here, because I've been thinking about these additional features we are going to build in the future. And I mean, for example, something really easy that will give a lot of value to the Web IDE would be linting, for example. It doesn't make sense that you have to open the terminal for having the linting functionality there. So I think we are attaching too many features to the fact of having the terminal. So I think we should think about the terminal as a separate feature. I mean, we have the file syncing mirroring feature, the live preview feature, and also the terminal. Okay, so the thing, why are we doing this, or why the workflow is like that with the Web IDE, is to avoid, for example, triggering new jobs when you just start the Web IDE, for example. So if we change this fact a little bit, if you know, when you start the Web IDE, it requires a couple of seconds to load the whole environment. So if at the same time we trigger some images, some helper images, or some additional services, for example, we can boost the terminal or the main build image. At the same time, we can trigger the live preview image. We can share that start time, that build, that container start time with the Web IDE loading time. Okay. What is the problem here? That we are going to start a lot of builds with every new Web IDE. So if you are going to open new Web IDEs in different tabs, you are going to start different, or you are going to start different containers. Well, maybe we can figure it out how to share these containers if you are the same user in the same project. I mean, we can figure something out, but I think this functionality, yeah.
No, I was saying either way, like, yeah, just the cost makes me feel a little shaky. But I think it's a really good idea, and I love that. Yeah, you're right. Why are we coupling? Now you have a full integrated environment once you open this web terminal. It'd be really neat and it'd be enhance the usability of the whole Web IDE if we actually provided the environment and it was a configurable environment for admins on start, where I don't need to type anything in terminal, but yeah, please lent my stuff for me. It would be great. I think that's a really cool idea. But I don't know if I mean, this kind of work we can either do on the server side or on the client side. And if we do it on the server side, I wish we knew how much. Well, how much dollars are we spending for someone to open up the Web IDE and Web Terminal for 30 minutes? And if that's not economical, we got to figure out a way to do this on the client side. I feel like, but if we don't have an answer to that question, I'm concerned with us going too far and then realizing we've made a non-economical decision. And maybe for engineers, we should be able to do the math there.
I guess it would depend on, so like if like from a user perspective and from like a financial model, right? Like if we're burning, if the Web IDE appropriately burns CI minutes, so uses the CI minutes that everyone gets for free, then in theory, we're covered. I actually don't know if those are instrumented correctly to use, like even though we're using CI functionality, I don't know if minutes in the Web IDE, especially like, so if you run the terminal and you spin up a container and it's on for 30 minutes, I don't know if that burns 30 minutes of your CI minutes. And so if it does, well, there's a business model there that exists and people get some free minutes. And then, you know, in fact, this is probably a worthwhile way to increase the number of CI minutes that people would use, right? Because it's one of the things that's hard for us to do is actually get people to use beyond their CI minutes. And so if this was a way that people started using more CI minutes, then like from a business case, that makes sense. If we're burning CI minutes for like just the IDE side of it, for like running all the linting and other stuff, I think that's where it becomes.
And that makes sense. So I think that's a good perspective, seeing like, is it economical for GetLab.com or GetLab us? But if it's also not economical for the users, and because this is an ultimate only feature, and right now the file syncing only works if someone the file syncing only works if someone sets up their own Kubernetes runner. If it's not economical for the user, then we've also kind of, but I'm not going to go so far to say that we have built something that's valuable. If anything, I mean, there's a strength to us just checking the box. Look, we've done the full DevOps lifecycle.
Yeah, I think from the business side, right, I think there's ways to deal with it. I think if you look at the market of, and I'd argue, and I think we talked about this, Paul, and I know Dawe knows. So we've talked about Git pods quite a bit, or gitpod.io. It's come up. I've talked to them a few times. Their business model is you get charged by the number of hours that your like entire Web IDE is online, right? And that's the business model. And I think so that to me, if the single point of data, but I'll say it seems like there's a use case and a business model there to support like, hey, even if we bring this down and make the whole Web IDE, like the entirety of the Web IDE free, treat it like CI minutes, you can have 10 hours a month of free complete Web IDE time, and then beyond 10 hours, you got to start buying and whatever in 10-hour blocks or something for very little money, right? I think there's a business model right on the .com side that's there. I think for self-hosted, I'm slightly less. I think there's an initial concern about self-hosted, right? Because or self-managed, because some people don't necessarily attach Kubernetes clusters. They're not using runners. There's those components. I think, you know, there's a multi-year plan, right, where the default deployment of GitLab becomes like on Kubernetes if you're running it locally. And so then like that stuff exists, and we could make some broad assumptions that like in multi-year, like
yeah,
in a future state, like Kubernetes will exist for everyone. And so like so it'll be there, and then like we'll take advantage of it at that point. And then in the meantime, like if you don't, then like, hey, look, you have to do X, Y, and Z to be able to use these features. And I don't think that's the end of the world.
Do you think it makes sense to maybe, I'm just imagining if we could do anything.
Yep.
Does it make sense to split up. You have CI minutes, and then you have Web IDE environment minutes. Like people should be able to use client-side Web IDE like for free, but if we're going to do Web IDE environment, do you think it makes sense to split it up? I can see users accidentally burning through their CI minutes, and now I can't merge requests because my builds aren't going through. Like I can see that being a huge frustration for users. It's really nice to split them up.
Yeah, I think from like an instrument and measurement perspective, right? I think users would prefer if like they had 2,000 CI minutes, and then we say like you get X number of complete Web IDE minutes, right? I think on the business side, I'm less concerned about solving it now because it is, most of these things sit in Ultimate only anyways, and so therefore they're paid for. So it's not necessarily a big deal about how we deal with it right now. I think if we get to a point where, right, which big tangent, but if we look at like how GetLab prices and decides where features go, right, we decide on the likely user. And if they're like a developer is the likely user, typically all that stuff ends up in like core and free because that's how that's supposed to work. And so if we assume that the Web IDE, that the likely user is a developer, which probably is, it's probably going to get to core or free with all of this stuff at some point, but we're going to have to do something to account for like usage runnage, right? Like that's the same reason I think CI minutes exist for everyone on free plans, but we capped it somewhere because it's right. There has to be some kind of resource usage mitigation there just to deal with some of that. And so I think that's, to me, that's where like we would get in a long-term state, but I think the feature set right now is still we're still working through the kinks of the feature set, which is good and bad. We don't have a ton of people on Ultimate, so we also don't have a ton of people using it, right? And we get less feedback on all these other things.
This is true. Yeah, I know we're running up to the end of our time here. So I think this last section is just like, and we've kind of touched on everything, and I appreciate everyone contributing to this game. But the last section is just how can we get there to the future that we're talking about? And I'm wanting to just put the question out here. Do we think that do we feel like we're on the right path, or do we feel like there's some adjustments that need to be made and maybe even communicate higher up to what our expectations need to be? I don't know what everyone thinks.
I think that's my question for you and Fran is like, if you go, and I think, and maybe you need the time to digest it, and I think that's fine. I think the live coding strategy was recently updated, and the Web IDE strategy was recently updated just to kind of reflect more of what we're thinking about further out. So maybe it makes sense, and I'll toss both of those in. Maybe it makes sense to like take a look at those, see what we're going to go do. And do you think, based on the path that we're on with the way we've coupled the CI stuff and the way we've coupled the other pieces here, are we on the right track? Or would you, if you could start over today, knowing everything that you know, would we go do something different? Would you pick a different underlying architecture? If you could do anything you wanted, would we go do it differently? And I think that's the question we should try and get an answer to. Like, would we do it differently, and would that enable these other things that we want to go do longer term easier now that some of that's more defined? Not greatly defined, but they're better than they were before, I think.
You probably know how I feel about this. My name's next to a lot of the weaknesses, and I created it. So I think, but I honestly don't quite know the answer. My biggest qualm is I look at our editor and I look at our console and terminal stuff, and I look at competing products, and granted, they're just 100% focused on that product.
Right.
And I see we've hit some functional check boxes where we can, on a marketing page, say, look what we've got. But there's some significant quality check boxes that don't go unnoticed, that are missing there. And if we think those quality attributes are important, I do think, yeah, we're going to have to rethink our strategy. If we think startup time needs to be less than 3 seconds or something, like we need to rethink our architecture. If we think based on some economic quality stuff, architecture drives those quality attributes. And I think those are the bits that I'm interested to know. How important are these to us? That's my 2 cents.
Yeah.
But I like a lot what you've been saying about, I looked into Thea IDE a little bit, and yeah, someone that specializes in this, and if we could kind of just piggyback on what they're doing or provide like GitLab integrations to something that's specialized in this, that's an interesting avenue to pursue. If there's some sort of technical partnership that could happen here. But I might be talking myself out of a job because I'm on the front end and on the editor.
Yeah, I don't know. No, so I think, yeah, I mean, that's the last item here is, right, the Thea IDE proof of concept. And so I think one of the things, and Mark is asking for this, Mark Hunsack. So I think one of the things we'll do is we'll spend some time in 12.2. Some people need to spend some time figuring out if this helps us get where we want to go faster and is better, or if we could build all of these things and it would be the same. I'd argue we probably can't, but Thea's got some real architectural differences in that it's a Docker container per instance, which is a lot different than what we do. So, I think there's some things to look at there and see how we could do it. It's also built on Monaco, so like anything that they're doing,
and that might be
there we can do too. But.
Yeah, I wonder if that might be the kind of architecture that would be useful for us. Kind of what Fran was talking about. Why do we have to start? Because right now, and even for live preview, what we're planning on, you'll have to start the terminal because that kind of kicks off the environment for things to happen. It'd be really neat if we always provided the full client-side version of the editor. But if an admin enabled it, there's the server-side version of the editor where, yeah, we spin up a Docker container environment for every editor, and that's environments kicked off. And that would decouple us from CI, and we could figure out maybe how, or maybe we're still borrowing some functionality from there, but I think that we could borrow maybe some of their ideas, if not their solution. It'd be interesting. And I like a lot what Fran's talking about of, yeah, it's weird right now. Everything's triggered by this. We're starting the web terminal from a user's perspective. I don't think that would make probably a lot of sense. And I'd really like maybe Marcel or for UX to look at this list of weaknesses and maybe look at what are our actual requirements here would be really helpful. Sorry to call you out, Marcel. I know I like it when you create issues.
No worries. I'm sure we can certainly look at that in the next milestone. I'm very sure.
I want to point out something. I mean, I like the client approach to this, but the main thing for this CI workflow is to have a sandbox of the repository. If we use a client-side approach, how do we perform all these operations, all these new functionalities? Are we going to build them up only in the client side? Are we use the GitLab API? And where are going those API calls point to? To the real repository?
That's a good point. When I said client side, I meant like almost the Web IDE as it is today without the terminal. Like I could just make edits and we're just
okay.
But it's almost like the environmentalist Web IDE.
But here's a crazy architecture thought for you. What if you require Docker to be available on the person's computer, and we ran Docker containers on their compute instead of on an attached Kubernetes cluster, and the Web IDE was a portal? So like, look, there's a bunch of ways that we could solve for, like, if we need Docker compute, if we need containerized compute somewhere, there are ways to do this in data centers. There's a way to do it in Kubernetes clusters. There's ways to do this. Maybe we say, hey, look, in order for the Web IDE to work, you have to have this agent running, or you've got to do something locally. And then like we can go and run arbitrary Docker containers on your machine, which would be likely insane and probably not the smartest thing. But just a thought, right? I think those are the things that we need to think about in terms of like, what are the best ways forward that get us the most stuff? And I think we just need to be more creative to make sure that we're accounting for longer term where we want to be. And I would say, like, take a look at the strategy docs. I think this was helpful to get a good understanding. So I think people understand there's some issues around where the Web IDE and the terminal stuff sits today and how these compute things are happening. I think, and I think, we should spend some time in 12.2. I think we're going to do a little bit of technical research versus actual delivery. And I think that's fine. I think we need to make sure that we're all on the same page moving forward about where we want to go.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for hopping on this call. And Marcus added a comment about using SSH and TMUX. And I really like the idea of, and for me, if this isn't economical for us, for any host to host this, if this isn't economic from like a CI perspective, yeah, if there's an architecture, we could offload this on the client side. I think that they'd prefer that because they'd have starter run-up time and that'd be easier connection for them. And we'd prefer that because it's cheaper for us. And it also let us probably lower the barrier of entry, which kind of kicked off this whole discussion. So, well, thanks everybody. And I hope this was helpful. And I know we didn't get to create maybe some issues on this call, but if I might go and create some issues if I don't see any here that are just some high level requirements issues. So cool. If nobody has anything else to say, I'm going to leave.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
See ya.